Good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to have a lecture over modernism. Instead of us taking up valuable class time and having you all bored listening to me drone on in class, I figured we could condense this down into about 10 to maybe 15 minutes of you completing this video and accompanying ed puzzle. So let's go ahead and start. With modernism, what we are looking at is a period of writing that a lot of the literature we're going to be studying for the rest of the quarter is going to come from. And one of the primary guides for this period is this quote you see down here of "make it new." Whereas modernism is about that. It's about breaking away from traditions in the creation of new ways of writing and new ways of thinking and new ways of viewing the world. Now, just to give you some context for this, the modernist period is said to occur from about 1900 to 1940. There's a little bit of, some conflict about that. Some people say it goes as far up to 1950, but that, just having an understanding of the general time period is fine. But the major historical events that shape this period and shape people's reactions to the world come from World War I, which we'll talk a little bit about later, the Great Depression, and then the rise of fascism. So these are the major historical events that occurred during this period. Other things you need to understand is that previously, what we were in terms of literature and art was the Romantic and Realist periods. Now, these periods were all about creating an objective view of the world, a bias-free view of the world that everyone could agree on was the actuality of existence. This is just the way the world is, this is the way it is for everybody. And with the Romantics, they also believed that nature and the beauty of nature is where we see and get the real truths of life. And so you can see this reflected in the art and the sample that I have here, a very realistic portrayal of the beauty of nature and the power of nature. Other things that come on during this period is the rise of city life and the rise of people moving away from being a primarily rural, agrarian-based society to a much more industrialized, urbanized society, which is another thing that occurs during this period as well. So what are some of the major influences during the modernist period? Well, let's just take a look at some of them. One of the first ones is the rise of a philosophical chain of thought called determinism, which has its roots kind of in science, where people begin believing that for every action, for everything that occurs, there is a discernible cause. It is also the idea that all mysteries in the world simply are problems that have yet to be solved. So the moving away from folklore and going to a much more scientific understanding of the world is something that has begun to happen, starting in the late 1800s and continuing on during this period as well. Another large influence is that of Charles Darwin, and the fact that his theory of evolution by this point is commonplace and very widely accepted by most people in society. Most scientists have fully explained it. There is some negative reaction from the church still, but it's that concept that humans are just the latest version of another type of animal also comes into play in people's understanding of the world. On top of that, you also have psychoanalysis, which was brought about by Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis being this method of trying to understand thoughts and actions. Some of you have already taken psychology and may have studied Freud a little bit, understand that some of his basic tenets, but one of the main ones is that life is a predictable pattern set in place by your parents. So again, going with this deterministic thought of all actions, all things that occur have discernible causes, Freud, helps feed into that as well. The mind is something that can be understood It has understandable influences. It has understandable desires. And people's actions are results of those understandable influences and understandable desires. When it's no longer angels speaking into our ear or devils speaking into our ear that make us behave a certain way, but the mind itself, and that we can understand that. The other thing to take note of, and this comes in with the rise of science, the rise of psychology, the rise of determinism, is that religion is on the decline. And World War I had a factor in that as well. What you see over here is an example of how people used to view the world. It is an example called the Great Chain of Being. And up top here, you have God, and all the way, underneath God, you have the angels, and then you have man, then you have animals of the sky and sea and earth, and then you have plants, and then you have minerals, and at the very bottom of the chain, you have the demons in hell. And the world was a hierarchy. There was a hierarchy in the structure of the universe. There was a hierarchy amongst the angels. There was a hierarchy amongst men, with the king being the top of the chain, followed by men being the next part of the chain, followed by women being the next part of the chain, followed by children. And it was like that in all the different realms. And during this period, we see that kind of debunked, and we see that kind of completely blown up and completely destroyed. And we see religion becomes into question, especially when Sigmund Freud says that it is simply an obsession based on death. What is a way to comfort yourself in the face of the fact that you're going to die, other than the idea that when you die, you will be reborn into paradise? And so Freud called that whole chain of thought into question. Lastly, as far as major influences go, then we have World War I. So this was a war that very few people who were actually fighting in it understood. They couldn't really grasp the reasons behind the war. 1/4 of all Englishmen at that age were killed. Millions of others died during the conflict as well. We see technology and industrialization being brought to bear, with it being used to kill many, many people. And it's a full display of man's inhumanity to man. And so again, this war had a great impact on not just the writing, but also the art, the architecture, the sculpture, and the philosophy of the modernist period. So what are the big philosophical concepts? What are the big themes that ends up running through a lot of the work created during this period? Well, they're very, it's very straightforward, and I hope I explained them well enough for you here. Don't hesitate to ask questions in class about these. But the first ones that you can see are, there's a strong intentional break with tradition. It's a break from not just established religious views, but established political views, established social views, and we see that depicted in kind of the art. Unlike the painting that you saw earlier with romanticism and realism, this painting is not a realistic or romantic depiction of the world. It is very abstract. It is bold colors, it's bright designs, and it kind of echoes this second point here, that the world is created in the act of perceiving it. That is, the world is what we say it is. And so a lot of the art that we see during this period does deal with the idea of perception and how the world is viewed, and how we can question the way the world is formed, and how everyone's view of the world is going to be different and individualistic. No one is going to see the world the same thing, much like how in this painting, everyone sees something different and everyone thinks something different of it. Another major concept that comes along with this period is there is not an absolute truth, whereas the romantics and the realists strove for an objective depiction of the world. The modernists throw that completely out the window. All things are relative. There is not an objective view of the world. There can never be such a thing. So again, this becomes reflected very much in painting, but also very much in the literature. We also see that people feel like there is no connection to the past. There is no connection to the history that brought us to where we are today. People are, again, trying to make it new. They're trying to break away from the way things were and are trying to create a new world and a new reality and a new way of writing and a new way of painting. And I think this painting on the left, The Scream, which some of you may have seen before, does a good job of highlighting the third concept here, which is life is an experience of alienation, loss, and despair. And we see that especially in some of the poetry we'll be looking at, that all of our lives and the lives of most humans is one felt of being alone, one of feeling not connected to other people, and one that is echoed by the loss of our dreams, the loss of our hopes, the loss of our loved ones, and one of the deep, deep sadness and anxiety. But there is, some kind of positive things going on. I mean, they do believe that the individual has an inner strength that is stronger than the forces that try and push us down. The inner strength, this individual can kind of rally and get past all of these things. They do believe that life, though, is unordered, that it is chaotic. And we see this again reflected in the paintings of the time, in the literature of the time, in the poetry of the time. It is about trying to break free from the old constraints of the way we do things. And lastly, there is a concern with the subconscious, this idea of what lies just below the surface in our minds. Again, going back to Freud and psychoanalysis, how there are these influences that weigh on us and influences that control what we do and how we think that we're unaware of. And here, you see this painting by Salvador Dali that is very much this very dreamlike, ethereal, strange depiction of the world, but at the same time looks very realistic in its depiction. Again, showing this concern with the subconscious itself. So that is more or less everything that you need to know right now about modernism and the modernist period. These are concepts and themes and ideas that are going to be coming up in class again and again and again. So feel free to post any questions you have in class or on the Google Classroom. And thank you very much for taking the time to watch the video today. Have a great rest of your night.